has not joined yet.
We got about 15 minutes, 20 minutes before we get to the Carolyn part. So we could either start or give her a minute or so, but we won't need her at least initially. Oh, and there she is.
Okay, good. So we're at 9 o'clock. So good morning, everybody. This beautiful spring day. Welcome to the meeting of the FFT committee. And Ellen, if you could please call the roll.
Certainly. Trustee Cates.
Yes.
Trustee Kane. I don't believe she's joined us. Trustee Ames is not able to join the meeting. Trustee Flood.
Yes, good morning.
Trustee McMahon.
Present.
Trustee Mishu.
Present.
Trustee Riley.
Here.
And that is all of the committee meetings, and we do have Trustee Alexander joining us.
Great. Good morning, Barbara. And also, I know I see Clyde Mitchell, one of the faculty reps to our committee. Clyde, good morning. Thanks for joining us. I don't see your colleagues, but hope maybe they'll be on shortly. Okay, so the first agenda item this morning is Ryan is going to lead us through the system and shared services budget, as well as budget changes since our last meeting together. So Ryan, we'll turn things over to you.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Super excited to be here this morning for us budget geeks. This is the best time after you've finished the budget and you're kind of in that limbo. So before I jump right into the slides, I just wanted to note a couple of things up front. As the chair said, we've got 3 tabs this morning. I'll walk you through most of those. I'll get a little help from Carolyn when we get to the budget changes, but generally this will be me walking you through these. Would strongly encourage, any questions along the way, please let me know. Otherwise, you'll just be hearing me for an hour straight, and nobody wants that. We have some time built in for Q&A, so happy to get rolling. Let me first thank the CBOs and the campuses for all of the work that they've done over the last few weeks. It was a really tight turnaround from the March meeting to today, and even to the next meeting that we have. I think the mail date for that is coming right up in like 2 days. So lots of work in a really short time. And so certainly want to thank the campuses for prioritizing all the work that we asked. Want to thank Sharon Buchanan, who put together the PowerPoint that I'm going to go through, and was up super early this morning making a whole bunch of changes. Want to thank Miriam White, who really pulled all of this together, and couldn't do this without her. And finally, I wanted to thank Angela in my office, who always does exceptional work, was in the office this morning before 6 o'clock, texting me, making sure I had everything I needed. And I appreciate her and Miriam letting me pretend like I run the show. So great work on their part. So let's jump right into the presentation this morning. Put a timer on myself here so I make sure I stay within my own guidelines. Share screen.
And Ryan, so do you prefer to get through this and then have questions, or are you happy to be interrupted with questions? I'm
happy to be interrupted. I'll only be able to see my screen on this end. So if you want to arrange that, or if you see anyone with their hands raised, or I do, certainly jump in. But happy to be interrupted along the way.
Okay, I can see almost everybody on my screen, but not everybody. So raise your hand if you've got a question, and if for some reason I don't call on you because I don't see it, just jump in. Feel free to jump in. Go. Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to minimize all the faces. So
now I can't see anybody's faces. So if you've got a question when the screen is full, just interject.
Okay, so we're going to start off with tab 1 this morning, and wanted to go through the governance and university services budget for you. We talked about that at the March meeting, I just wanted to kind of get into the details of this. So when we talk about the system office, we're really talking about 3 different units here. There's governance, there's university services allocated, and then what we refer to as university services unallocated. And I'll walk through each of the pieces over the next few slides. So governance is, I think, commonly what we refer to as the system office. It is made up, as you can see, of the trustees, the chancellor, the senior leadership, and the support staff. As you can see on the screen, it is 25 individuals. For some historical reference, I went back, a number of years. It's been pretty stable at that number. The 8 support staff has been consistent going back a number of years. The 17 number has fluctuated up and down, mostly not necessarily because of new positions, but positions like Miriam White, like Tracy Elliott, that used to be over in university services allocated where they were allocated, their costs were allocated out to the campuses, shifted them over to governance a few years ago because it felt like that made more sense. It's a neutral budget impact for the campuses, but more appropriately puts some of the people kind of in the categories or in the buckets where they should be. So a fairly stable number, again, over the last several years. Here's the details of the governance budget. As I mentioned early on, this is funded off the top of the state appropriation. So, imagine 220 million coming in from the state. In this case, the first 6.7 of that covers the governance piece. You can see that right here, if you can see my mouse, state appropriation will equal the total expenses. That's how we know that we're balanced. You can see here that the budget is flat largely from 23 to 24. You see a 0.1% increase there, about $8,000, but generally pretty flat. The modest increases that you'll see here are generally related to things like software. A lot of the software agreements that David and his team run have automatic escalators in there. You'll also see right in the middle of the page, memberships, contribution, and sponsorships. That one is up, you can see, by 63% this year. That is simply because as we've moved into unified accreditation, those individual dues that campuses paid to NECHI, now those are rolled up into a single system cost. So it provided some modest budget relief for each of the campuses, and now those show up here in the governance line. If I move on to
I'm sorry, Ryan, just 1 second. I see Barbara Alexander has her hand up. Go ahead, Barbara.
Thank you. And it's possible that your next slides will answer this question, but where are the consulting contracts that the system office relies on for marketing, for example, or other activities by the system as a whole?
Yeah, you'll see, as you guessed, you'll see those coming up in a few slides. Marketing, for instance, you'll see in university services unallocated, or university services. Is it university services unallocated? You'll see that coming up in just a few slides.
Thank you.
So here's university services allocated. So this is, I think, when you generally think of shared services across the system, this is the bucket that you're really thinking about. This is the centralized services that make up, as you can see here, IT, HR, finance, facilities, risk, procurement, general counsel's office, and the shared processing center. 386 individuals. 2 years ago, or a year ago, excuse me, that number was 391. So it's down just a little bit from 24 into 23. Let me give you just a little bit more detail about university services. So it's broken out into 2 buckets. So again, on the last slide, I talked about it being a $52 million operation. You can see that 38 million of that is what we referred to as unified services. So these are staff individuals that are responsible for oversight and support for all campuses. You can see that in the middle line. So again, the example that we gave here is the controller's office, providing that centralized financial activities across the system. We don't do that, as you would expect. We wouldn't do that at the campus level. That's also where generally a lot of the IT costs show up there, although portions of them are down in campus services. But that is the bulk of unified services, really the bulk, as you can see, of university services. The second component of that is campus services. It is 14 million. So these are still system employees, but as you see in the description, their primary responsibility is to a specific campus. So think about, a campus CBO, Chief Business Officer. They work specifically for a campus during the day. Nonetheless, they are a system employee with a dual reporting line to both myself and to a campus president. Same thing if you drill down and think about campus HR staff, some campus-specific facilities staff. That's the distinction here between unified services and campus services. Campus services is a little unique in that campuses do have the ability to request essentially additional staff if they're willing to pay for that. So you might imagine a campus like, we provide a uniform set of services across the system to each of the campuses, but you might imagine that there's a circumstance where, where Orono needs additional IT staff for something very specific, something unique to the research mission, something along those lines. In those kind of situations, the campus can request additional resources, additional staff, assuming we go through the process and approve that on our end. That is a bill that entirely goes to that individual campus. So if Orono, for instance, again, wants to add additional IT staff, that's not a cost that will flow out to Fort Kent or to a Presque Isle. It ends up being unique to that particular campus. So here's university services allocated. This is the breakdown for that. A couple of facts overall, and then I'll talk about some of the details here. So again, we have those two pieces: the university, the unified services, and the campus services. Overall, unified services are going up in this budget by 2%. If you do nothing, if the only thing we do is give cost of living increases, a budget would go up by 4%. 4.5%, excuse me, 3% for a compensation increase, 1.5% for the impact on the benefit rate. So anytime you can keep that rate below 4.5, you're actually kind of pulling back from where you were in the previous year. So unified services is going up by 2%. Campus services is going up by 6.1%. And again, that is related to some specific position requests at a couple of those, at a couple of individual campuses. You can see in the salaries and wages line, there's an additional HR position at USM that is a part of this as well. So that's how you get the difference in the two. Overall, university services is going up by 3.1% or 3%. You can see it. That's this middle line here. For shared services, you see the $52 million base that we talked about on the previous page. Couple of highlights again in here. You can see labor relations costs up. EAB is down in the membership's contributions. Again, making some changes to our service there. Again, you can see some increases related to IT software, wireless network, those type of investments that we need to keep up with infrastructure investments. You'll recall the board made some significant investments in IT in 2017, 2018 with some funds that the state provided to us. It's time to refresh some of those. And so you'll see some of those come in here as well. And then
Ryan, sorry to interrupt. Mike Scott, please go ahead.
Yes, if I may ask the question, Ryan.
Yeah, please.
As the campuses are addressing budget cuts or deficits, when does the system shared services reflect that, or is that isolated from what the campuses are experiencing?
I wouldn't say isolated. I mean, I'd say, each of our budget units, whether it's the campuses or the university services, have been, going through this kind of budget build process since last winter into the spring. I know that we've gone through kind of those same exercises. So we knew, coming into this, again, if university services was just on autopilot, we would have been looking at a 4.5% increase. We knew we didn't want to pass a 4.5% increase onto the campuses. So we started kind of, again, that same prioritization process that the campuses did, looked for any opportunities where we could to make reductions. And so you saw me earlier mention that, for university services, last year we had 391 positions. We trimmed that back. We left at least six positions vacant. So everywhere where we had an opportunity to cut back, we did that. But we also needed to recognize that we had, again, not that different than campuses. We have some cost escalators in there that we simply need to fund. So salary and wage increases is certainly one of those. But a number of these IT contracts that have escalators in them, the wireless network investments, we need to keep up with those. It was only 5 years ago or so when we had campuses that couldn't provide kind of reliable internet access, in our dorms and so on. So we don't want to get back into that situation. So really a long way of saying we went through kind of that same process and feel comfortable that we were able to minimize any increase, prioritize any savings that we could push back to the campuses.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, no, great question. I've got a couple of minutes left in this part of the presentation. So this is my last slide in the university services piece. And then again, we've got happy to take any questions. We've got some Q&A a little later in the agenda, so happy to take some there if questions come up to you at that point. But let me wrap up this section by talking a little bit about university services unallocated. So this is simply recognizing that we get dollars from a handful of different sources. From the legislature, we receive targeted funds for adult degree completion. We receive funds for early college. We have some modest investment income from previous years. We've got strategic funds that are dollars that roll up as a modest percentage of new appropriations. And when those dollars come up, we go again through that same process and put together recommendations. So most of the items that you see on this page are items that have been a part of our budget for a number of years. So when we did a lot of the consolidations in IT, facilities, finance, and achieved savings there, the board made the decision a number of years ago that we were going to use some of those savings to invest in the research reinvestment fund, for instance. You see right in the middle of the page, $2.1 million. The board made the decision that we would set aside a certain amount of dollars for a demolition initiative to take down old buildings at the campus level. We made the decision a couple of years ago that we were going to invest in some system-wide marketing. At that time, or currently, it's $400,000. This budget, we're recommending to take that up to $750,000. So this page really just represents kind of us pulling all of those separate initiatives together in one page, so you could see both what they were funding and how they helped advance or help support. Sorry, my timer's going off. How they help support the UMS strategic plan. So you'll see again, not new investments largely, but we were able to kind of pull them in. The new ones that we do have here, I want to highlight a couple of those. So again, I did mention the increase in system-wide marketing. Wanted to note near the very bottom there, you'll see system-wide research support. So the University of Maine has been super generous with their research staff, assisting a number of campuses with their initiatives. A lot of this earmark work, the work we've been doing with the state, just really, really great work. But we need to provide some support there. It's not sustainable in the long term to continue to rely on just that university, the University of Maine staff. And so we're recommending in here an investment of about $900,000 to fund a handful of positions at the Orono campus that can continue to provide some of that critical research support for all of our campuses. You'll see the last item at the bottom. The bottom is the capital investment, $2 million. So that is really the depreciation amount that we set aside for IT. Again, focused on renewing those wireless infrastructure investments that we made a number of years ago. So that gets us through this portion of the presentation. Before I go into budget changes, let me just stop sharing my screen for a second. See if you have any questions on this part, Mr. Chair, before we move on to the budget changes.
Yeah, I've got one, Ryan. The capital planning, 1.3 million. What's included in that?
Yeah. So one of the things that we've found is, and I mentioned this statistic before, when we look historically at how much we spend on capital and how many board approved projects we have going at any one moment, we can go back almost forever. And the number adjusted for inflation tends to be right around that $50 million number or less. Last year or in 22, that number was closer to 300 million. We expect it to be as high as 400 million in 2024. So we are overseeing lots and lots more projects than we have in the past, which, as you would imagine, puts a strain on our facilities staff, Carolyn McDonough's shop, and so we needed to add staff there. And so typically we can charge those to the projects, but we can't charge everything to those individual campus projects. And so this investment right here, a continuation of investments that we've made in the past, simply funds a lot of the extra staff that we needed in Carolyn's shop to fund all of these projects that we've got going on system-wide.
Thanks. Pat Flood.
Thank you. Ryan, I agree with this change that recommends 900,000 to the system-wide research. I think that's obviously been something that the Maine campus has been doing a significant function there for quite a while. Is that something that you view and the campuses review it, see it as permanent or temporary? And is that a long-term solution, or is that a stopgap to get us to some broader kind of a system approach?
Yeah, I think the intent is that it is long-term, as long as, these dollars, most of these dollars that you see on this particular page are largely ongoing dollars. I think, in our perfect world, there would be plenty of work for Joan's staff and plenty of work, research work going on all of our campuses. So I would hope that it would be a permanent need that we would have, but let me just quickly defer to Joan to see if she wants to add anything to that.
No, other than, of course, I think on behalf of all of our campuses who are engaged in and looking to expand their research activity, being able to have the right supports in place to do that, and at this time, building out from what the University of Maine has seems the logical thing to do because of the expertise here, but it will bolster our research productivity, our opportunity to bring in external funding. And I'm hearing great interest and enthusiasm and really good ideas from across the system on how to keep doing that. So we hope it will last for a while.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Other questions? So Ryan, these expenditures are in pursuit of the strategic plan that is, I guess, that is currently in place, or the one we've been, the principle has been working from. So presumably when we pass a new strategic plan this year, that's going to inform these kinds of expenditures next year and in the future. Is that a fair statement?
That's absolutely right. I think this year we kind of, working with the chancellor and our leadership team, looked across where the expenditure areas were. Marketing is a good example. That's one we put in place last year. We think it's been really successful. It's a place where we think, consistent with the plan, we want to make more investments in that space. But again, I think it's always subject to an annual review and a change based on, the direction that we get from the board.
And as we hopefully rebuild our reserves in coming years, if the market turns around, is this a working list of how we might invest those monies as well?
Yeah, a little bit. I think I draw the distinction between we have reserve buckets, and then we have the budget stabilization fund. So similar to state government, we want to set aside, let's pretend we have a really good year in the market. We want some money to go into the budget stabilization fund, which we want to replenish that. And that is the fund that we would typically use to help out a campus that is going through difficult situation. So I just want to draw a distinction between the budget stabilization fund and a reserve fund where we might do really well. And we say, let's set aside $5 million and we'll have conversations with the board about how we can allocate those best. So just drawing a distinction between those two reserve funds, but your question is right on.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you for that. David McMahon.
Well, probably an unfair question, but I'll ask it anyway. Does anybody know what the multiplier effect is of the system-wide research support of $875,000? How much are we likely to bring in extra because we're spending that money?
Let me pass that unfair question on to Joan.
Thank you for that unfair passing along. It's a great question, Trustee McMahon. This hasn't started yet. And so we're putting this in place if this budget is approved in terms of the enhanced availability. I think what it will first show is simply in the number of faculty and staff across the system and students who are electing to get involved in research who hadn't been doing very much before. So that kind of multiplier, it'll be in steps. It'll start with metrics that are about simply numbers. Then it will go to numbers of proposals submitted and then numbers of proposals achieved. And so it will take us 2 or 3 years to get to a really robust set of indicators. But I would be very optimistic based on what we're seeing already that we'll at least get a doubling of that amount in terms of external grants coming in within 3 to 4 years.
Thank you. Other questions before Ryan moves on? I'm not seeing any, Ryan, so go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. So the next, before I start sharing again, the next section is budget changes. So this is really just wanted to inform the committee of any changes that have happened since the March presentation up until now. It's not unusual for us to have changes in this space, and we do have changes here. So the biggest change item that we have this round is related to the contract conversations that we've been having with AP. We've talked about those before with this committee. And so, Carolyn, I'm going to turn this over to Vice Chancellor Dorsey to give us a short update on how those conversations have gone. And then that will lead into the budget changes next.
Sure. Thank you, Ryan. So I just want to quickly, for anyone that is new to the conversation, Academic Partnerships, or AP as we refer to them, they're an online program manager. The system signed an agreement with them back in September of 2018 for services around our online accelerated programs that we were attempting to grow and develop and kick off in some areas, mostly relating or oftentimes relating to the adult learner, but not always. It isn't strictly prohibited to that. But we signed a 10-year contract that included about 6 or 7, depending on how you look at these areas of service. They relate to things like marketing, enrollment specialists, retention specialists, academic services. These are the areas that AP offers in the contract. And for those services, the contract requires a 50% revenue share. So all of the tuition dollars that come in under these particular programs, the campuses then offer back to AP 50% of the revenue from those programs. So initially in 2018, there were 3 campuses that signed on to this agreement, UMFK and USM, around graduate nursing and education programs primarily. And then UMPI joined the mix with their undergraduate competency-based education program. So those 3 campuses have been involved for about 5 years. We're about halfway through the contract now. And for a couple of reasons, we haven't been incredibly pleased with the performance of them as our program manager, with some enrollment concerns. And also, I think more importantly, a lack of perhaps of us being able to realize all of the services that were offered under that contract. So because of that, in talking with Ryan and the chancellor and the leadership teams at those campuses, they had asked me to go back to AP and look at the contract and see if there was anything that we could do. I'm very, very pleased to report that the negotiations have been going well. And at this point, they have agreed that they will get rid of the revenue share. So we will no longer have any type of payments going back to them based on our enrollments. Rather, we're going to shift to a fee for service. And under that model, each one of the campuses can look at the services that AP would provide and then decide what they would like assistance with moving forward. So while we're very really beginning those kind of in the weeds with what those particular contracts would look like, it appears as though the 3 campuses would most likely retain them for primarily marketing and recruitment services, and not use academic retention, some of those other services that we really just weren't able to utilize fully anyway. So because of that, and again, it's a little bit different based on the campus and what they decide or elect to do as a fee for service moving forward. But in the last year, as part of the revenue share, we offered them about 1.4 million. I think it was just under 1.4 million a piece. It was anywhere from 1.2 to 1.4 million per campus. So almost 4 million in total went to AP in a shared revenue model. In this new area, again, depending on how the campuses decide they would like to utilize their services, each campus could probably in this new contract see a savings of anywhere between 700 to 900,000 in that revenue share. So each campus is working right now to see what their actual savings will be, and then where they would apply those savings in their budget, which I believe is what Ryan and the team will talk about next. But they should be able to realize anywhere from $700,000 to $900,000 in savings in this upcoming year.
Thanks, Carolyn. Questions about AP? So suggesting that maybe that the total cost may go from something over 4 to something under 2 or under 1. I didn't quite do the math there, but.
Well, I'll say it and then someone else could do the math. So I would guess they would go from about, maybe let's just say 1.2 as an average, that they probably will reduce down to the 500,000 range. So maybe between 600,000 to 700,000 per campus times the 3 campuses. So I'll say,
Thanks.
I don't even know if that adds up.
Thanks. Any idea on the timeline for these negotiations to get concluded?
Yep. So at this point, AP has given us sort of the broad parameters of what they would like to do. I'm working with each one of the campuses to get from them what they would like as their fee for service and then to the amount. So AP said, come back to us and say the University of Maine at Presque Isle would like to spend 500,000 just simply for the marketing and advertising elements. And then we'll work through adjusting the contract accordingly. So what I did ask the campuses to do, and the only reason that we haven't solidified exactly what they're asking AP for yet, is making sure there aren't any of those kind of hidden services we may need. If we continue to use them for marketing and the enrollments do continue to grow, but then we aren't using their admission specialists, is that going to have a ripple effect on the campus? Are they going to need to, hire an admissions person? Is there a cost associated with that? So we just want to make sure that we look at what we're going to be asking them for services, but are there any unintended consequences to the budget that we need to consider before we offer a final contract? But they've been very helpful in their negotiations, and I believe they're looking to make these changes pretty quickly.
Thanks. Other questions for Carolyn on this? I'm not seeing any. So thank you very much.
So I will, I'm going to flip back to the presentation here in a sec, but just let me just wrap up this piece right here. What you're going to see this morning, what you're going to see in about 15 seconds is the budget changes. We have incorporated some of the impact of the AP change at Presque Isle so far, but it's early enough so that we're still estimating what the impact would be and how it would play out at USM, how it would play out at Fort Kent. So I think it's possible that sometime before your meeting on the 26th, we might have a second change to offer. It would be specific to this one area, just because, again, these are like real-time negotiations that are going on. And so I am going to show you some of the impact of the change at Presque Isle, but the other campuses, we just need to do a little bit more analysis there. So let me get back into the point. So now we're back to budget changes. So this chart for our FFT members should be familiar. This is part of our regular budget presentation. It also looks similar to the budget forecast that we do. And again, just to get you familiar, this is, I always start with Orno since they're at the top of this chart. You can see this is when we presented in March. Forecasting about a $7 million E&G deficit, about $500,000 in auxiliary, gives you a combined deficit of roughly 7.4 million, resolved through a transfer from campus reserves, no budget stabilization funds from the system, and that gets the campus to a balanced budget. And you see the numbers here for each of the individual campuses as we presented them to you in March. So let me show you the revised version of this. Here is the April version, and let me just walk you down through this campus by campus and highlight the places where there were changes. So starting at the top, for the University of Maine, no changes to the bottom line. So this chart looks exactly the same as what you saw in March. The one thing that has changed, and you'd see this in some of the individual specific campus numbers, if you really drill down into the department numbers in Orono, is that the one thing that has happened since March is the campus presented a number of efficiency initiatives. They totaled roughly $10 million. When we presented those to you in March, they were in a single account where we were recognizing the full value of those efficiencies. Since then, the campuses went through and assigned values to individual departments and colleges and so on. So excuse me. So really just distributing the impact of that same initiative that you saw previously. So for my former friends from the Appropriations Committee, very similar to the statewide initiatives that we used to do, that we would initially present to you as a single item, and then later by financial order, we would go and distribute that to all of the departments. This is a similar method here. No change to the initiatives, no change to the bottom line, but that does show up if you start to look into the individual departments and details at the University of Maine. For the University of Maine at Augusta, there are no changes since March. Same thing at Farmington and also at Fort Kent. No budget changes yet. At Presque Isle, we did have changes there. So again, if I go back and you just focus on the Presque Isle line, you can see originally forecasting a deficit of 220 in E&G, 345 in auxiliary for a combined deficit of 566. We flash forward, you can see now we're forecasting a modest surplus on the E&G side, a deficit in auxiliary for a total deficit of 260. Again, compared to the 566, you can see that that's a $306,000 positive change. There are a handful of ins and outs that are getting you to that number. We know the AP change is about 495,000 to the positive. There were a handful of expenses that came along with that that netted out some of that cost. There were a few, again, some ups and downs, modest ones in just a few handful of energy changes and some small lines like that. But overall, the Presque Isle changes net out to a positive $306,000 impact to the bottom line. At USM, the bottom line is the same. So the campus, again, just if you focus in on the line at USM, you can see the bottom line is the same. It is a balanced budget. The E&G line in this case has improved by a positive 140,000. The auxiliary line dropped down just a smaller surplus by the same amount. So the campus is still in that balanced situation. What has shifted is just a little bit of a difference between the E&G and the auxiliary lines. Maine law is the same proposal that you saw in March as well. And then finally, governance and university services. That one has changed just by 20,000. So again, if you look at that line here in March, you can see it at 488. If I flash forward to April, it's now 508. So the gap, if you will, is increased by 20,000. It's not so much a gap as it is early college is funded from this line. We have an early college reserve. So again, those are dedicated funds. They need to be spent on early college. And the early college team has recommended spending an additional $20,000 over the budget in March. And so you'll see that increase here. Again, no impact to the bottom line. Those are dedicated dollars. They need to be spent on early college, and that's what we're doing here, but it does change the look of this spreadsheet. So Mr. Chair, that covers the budget changes that we have for this round. And before I go on to tab 3, I just wanted to pause and see if you had any questions.
Thanks. Trish Riley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ryan, could you just remind me the UMPI and Fort Kent show budget stabilization numbers in a budget we didn't want budget stabilization funds used? Is that the carryover numbers, or will that be offset with AP?
Yeah, so thank you for reminding me of that. Those are dollars where the board approved budget stabilization funds in fiscal year 23. And the campus did not spend all of those dollars. So there's a couple of options when that happens. The system can take those dollars back. What we've tended to do more often than not is allow the campus, to the extent they need them, allow them to roll those funds forward and then use them in the next budget year. I think it makes sense for the campuses. It rewards them for being more efficient. The alternative, and it's something we've run into before, is that certainly no one on this call would ever do it, but people will spend down those dollars if they think you're going to take them back. And so this encourages everyone to be as efficient as they can, knowing that if they're able to save some of those dollars, then it can help provide some budget relief in the next budget year. And that's what we've recommended to the board here. So that 760,000 combined is not a new commitment, but just carrying forward a previous one.
Thanks for clarifying.
Yep. Thank you for the question.
Any other questions about those changes? I don't see any, so we're a little bit behind schedule, but not very much. Ryan, are you done with that agenda item now?
I am done with that one. I'm ready to move on to the allocation model if you are ready for that.
We are ready.
Okay, so there were some questions about the allocation model in some of our budget meetings. We have some trustees that were here for part of those conversations, some who are brand new to it. So we spent time on the October FFT agenda, rolling through the appropriations and allocation model. So even though I've got a bunch of slides, I'm not going to try to cover all of those slides. I did want to highlight just a couple of them for anyone that wasn't at the April meeting, the October meeting, or anyone that just would love to see that presentation again. That presentation is still online. You can still go in and check out that presentation, always available to answer questions on the appropriation and allocation model. But really wanted to spend the time this morning in the 15 minutes or so that I have, just really telling you where we are kind of in the evolution of this model, talk a little bit about where we started, where we are now, and what comes next. So again, not going to rely on a lot of these slides, but there's a couple that help with some of that table setting. So I wanted to keep them in the presentation. I wanted them to be here for context to let you look at them in advance, but I won't spend a lot of time on the individual slides, more on the discussion about the phases of where we are in the project. So appropriations and allocation model, we started this work in 2014, 2015, recognized that we had some challenges with the allocation model, mostly because it wasn't really a model. It was really just reflecting what happened when the system came together in 1968. Largely, the campuses brought the appropriation that they had at the time with them. And that is largely what we used for an allocation model for nearly 50 years. So if you look here, you'll see the pre-2013, that was generally the historical allocation that went to the campuses. Those percentages were consistent nearly every year without regard to changes in mission, changes in enrollment. This was just an automatic take the check we get from the state, and 50% goes here and 25% goes there. So not surprisingly, what we found after 50 years of the model being on autopilot is that we had a lot of perceived and real kind of imbalances in what the appropriation was. And so we had, again, populations have shifted a little bit, but when we started this exercise, Presque Isle and Fort Kent, largely had, I think when we looked at it at the time, had almost the same number of faculty, the same number of students. Everything at this point in time was pretty equal. Yet at that point in time, Presque Isle's appropriation was more than $1 million a year higher than it was at Fort Kent. So, over 50 years, that's a pretty significant difference between two campuses that were, at least at that time, roughly the same size, had similar issues with UMA. Felt like we were underfunded there given the size of the campus. And so we started a lot of this work in 2015. It lasted probably at least 18 months. I think it was an unprecedented amount of discussion and public hearing, public forums at each of the individual campuses, many times, lots of updates to this committee, and finally arrived at some consensus and implemented this new model that you see over here on the far right in 2020. One of the hangups that we have had is it's not that everyone loved the previous formula that we had for 50 years. It was every time you proposed a change, there was a winner and there was a loser. And that just almost killed the conversation right off the start. And so we agreed on starting in 2020, the base allocations that the campuses had at that point in time, that would be locked in, and that the model would simply impact new funding dollars. So if the legislature gave us $1 million in new money, the base appropriations would go out to the campus, and the new money would flow through the allocation model. So that was how we built consensus. That's how we got to the point where each of the presidents and the board unanimously recommended that this model move forward and be implemented. Going to flash forward. One of the key parts of the new model was the establishment of peers. So at the heart of the model, what we were looking to do was establish peers for each of our campuses through a scientific process, and not a sitting around the table, who do we think our peers are process. And so we worked with Hanover Consulting. We worked with our campuses. We developed peers for each one of the campuses. You can see here, I think we've got Fort Kent here in the front. You can see the peers that we initially came up with. There's a similarity score that goes from 0 up to 1. The closer you are to 0, then the closer that peer is to kind of what you look like. So just at a high level, you can see up here where my mouse is, you can see the University of Idaho initially was the #1 peer for the University of Maine, similarity score of 0.06, which means it looks a lot like the University of Maine. Contrast that over here with UMA. You can see here in the top right, their closest peer is at 0.11. So still fairly close. But as you would imagine, it was really, it's harder to find a peer that looks exactly like UMA. Open access, doesn't have, at least again, when we started this, didn't have any residential facilities. So as you would expect, the peers were a little wider in how they were scattered. But nonetheless, kind of walk through this process for each one of the peers. And the goal was to make sure that a campus was funded appropriately in relation to its peers. And so we went through a process, and again, I'm going to go through these super quick, kind of went through a process of establishing cost centers, looking into IPED's data, how we measured, contributions to research and public service and academic support, and so on. And you can see really, really driven by the data. So we used 3 years worth of peer data. This right here represents some of the data that we pulled together for USM's peers back in 13, 14, and 15. So you can see exactly how much their peers spent on instruction costs in this example. And then we normalize all of the data down to a per FTE amount. So it's great that, Cal State University, in this case, is spending $60 million on instruction costs, but how much is it per student? And that's the numbers that you see down here. So we come up with a per student FTE rate of 75.85 for USM's peers. And then we go through a process of comparing that to what USM is spending on its peers, how that number would relate based on the number of FTE at USM over a 3-year period. And again, we do that over a number of categories for each one of our campuses in academic support in all of those areas, and arrive at what we think the total amount of appropriation should be for a campus. How much should they be spending in these 8 or 9 cost areas? What are we spending versus what our peers are spending? And then we go through some complex analysis on how we distribute new dollars. And so again, super quickly here, you can see this really represents right here, this column, percent funded. How much are you funded in relation to your peers? And so what you can see from this initial analysis that we did a number of years ago is it showed us that at the time, UMA and Fort Kent were our most underfunded campuses. You can see right here, Machias at the time was its own unit, but because it was losing students so fast, the model was suggesting, the appropriation should be 4.6 million. But we were already given the campus at that time 5.2 million. So the model doesn't take away funds. I mentioned that in one of the early slides. So that's why you see a campus like Machias in this case funded at 111%. We turn this percent funded into what we refer to as a disparity percent. So what happens is if we get $1 million, what the model does is it pushes 25% of that of the new money to Fort Kent, 25% to UMA, and you see the percentages and how they work. And we do that calculation every year. We go in, we look at new IPEDS data, we look at peers, and we look at new cost structures and repeat this analysis every year. The great thing about the thing that we like most about the model is that it's dynamic, that it changes based on if I go back here and you look at that percent funded column, the analogy I always like to use is that think about those, percent funded. If you're at 100%, picture a glass of water filled all the way to the top. In this case, the UMA and the Fort Kent examples, the glass would only be about 70% full. The Machias one, we've got water spilling over onto the table, and the others are where they are. And so every time we get new money, picture of water, we start pouring into the glasses, and the goal of the model is to get everyone up to the same level, so that even if we're not all funded at 100% of our peers, maybe we're all funded at 95% or 90% or whatever that number might be. So the model is dynamic in that sense that it pushes money to the campuses that are the most underfunded, but then it balances out over the years. So if you remember back to one of the first slides I showed you, roughly 75% of the historic appropriation goes to Orono and to USM. And that was the case before the model. New money was distributed in the same way. In the first year we had the model in place, instead of 75% going to the two largest campuses, actually 80% went to the smaller campuses and just 20% at Orono. That evolves as you move forward in the model. So the next year, again, a little bit less to Fort Kent because their glass was just getting up there. A little bit more to Farmington in this example. The Orono USM number moves from 20% up to 27%. As these glasses, if you will, start to get fill, now more money is going to the two larger campuses, which are now the most underfunded of those campuses. So last year, or this current budget that we're in, 34% of the new dollars went to USM, 28% to Orono, 26% to UMA. And now you can see Fort Kent, Presque Isle, Farmington are getting up to about what we think is the appropriate level with their peers. The 24 numbers, if we had that pie chart, would show, again, in this case, a little bit more than 50% of the new dollars going to Orono now, a little bit less down to UMA, a little bit less to USM. And then what we expect, and this is my last slide on here, so let me stop sharing and give you my kind of final conclusion here on this part. So what we expect, so what happens next? Once we get all the glasses up to the same kind of level of funding, where do we go from there? So what we've put in place is starting in June, after we get by this budget, we're going to pull all of the CBOs in our group back together again, do a comprehensive review of the model, understand what has worked over the last few years, what maybe hasn't. Engage in conversations with the presidents. We want to engage in conversations with this committee and talk about what comes next. Do we just level out at a 45, 25, 10, type percentage, and that's what we do forever going forward? Do we set aside more dollars into a centralized pool that then could be allocated for multi-campus initiatives? Those are all great questions that appropriately we don't have the answers for on the front end before we do the work, but that's what we would envision as kind of the next stage. Starting this summer, going out, having conversations with the campuses again, and then reporting back to this committee in the November, early next year kind of window to recommend changes for the next round. So I think I'll stop right there and see if there are any questions about the allocation model or where we go next.
What a succinct presentation that was, Ryan. Thank you. Complicated subject. Barbara Alexander.
Thank you. I don't criticize at all the historical pressures that led and the decisions made about the model that's currently being used. But what bothers me about it is the formulaic approach does not allow any flexibility with respect to achievement of the goals and objectives that we hope to lay out in our strategic plan. So what you're describing is potential reforms. And one of the areas that I would be interested in is what can be done with regard to allowing the board and the system to identify innovative programs and choose to reward a campus or a program with additional funding based on good work that has been done. And if that's the intent or built into the discussions that you want to have moving forward, I would be happy to hear that.
Yeah, it's a great observation. And if you peeked at the slides advance or looked at it quickly before I advanced it, that very first slide that I showed, or that I at least spent some time talking about, the bar charts and so on, one of the things that you'll find before we made this change is that the board wanted to do kind of exactly what you talked about. How do we reward campuses for being innovative and for making changes? So what we did before we made this change was we dabbled in outcomes-based funding for a little while. We had that in place at the system for about 3 years, and we initially took 5% of the appropriation, and then the idea was the next year we would take 10 and 15, up to the point where after 4 years, the goal of the board was that we would have 20% of the appropriation set aside, and it would be focused on specific outcomes that the board was looking for. But what happened is this is pre-unified accreditation. So this is when we were having conversations about getting to where we are now. And what we found is that those initial outcomes that the board established, when we moved more into the unified kind of conversations, is that those initial goals kind of worked against unified accreditation. So they were things like, we want to see increases in graduation rates. And so that felt like a good thing at the time. But what we found is now all of a sudden campuses didn't want to cooperate as much on 3+1 agreements, because if I'm going to do all the hard work for 3 years and then the student's going to transfer over somewhere else, that campus would get credit for the graduating student. The other campus would get dinged because their graduation rate went down because the student didn't graduate there. And there were all kinds of examples like that felt well-intentioned, but were working against the direction that we wanted. So we repealed that, went with this new model. But I think a version of exactly what you're talking about is where we want to go next. It's just making sure that the goals that we set don't increase competition, and they're true to what the strategic plan ultimately will look to do.
Before we get to Pat, Ryan, any idea of timeline for that process you're suggesting to reevaluate the formula?
Yeah, so what we would do, we did this the first time around and it worked really well, is I think one of the first things that our group will do when we convene in June is to develop a charter that lays out exactly what we're going to do and exactly what we're going to look at, something that we can shop around and get feedback from campuses and the board and others. And then part of that charter would be a recommended timeline. Once we get buy-in to that, it really helps the next stages of the work that we would do. So we've talked about trying to do something and get a recommendation, potentially to the board by early in the next calendar year, late in the calendar year. We need to do it early enough to impact the budget. So that's that's the initial thinking, but I want to get all the feedback from the CBOs. I want to understand what they're thinking as well. So that's the early thinking, but absolutely we'll be back to you in this committee to talk about that program in more detail.
Thanks. Pat Flood and then Clyde Mitchell. Pat?
Thank you. I'm one step removed from this because I haven't been here for as long as some folks. It sounds like I know it's very thorough and it's certainly a very strong statistical process. I'm thankful for that. But I was just wondering, we've been doing this since 2020, at least implementing, you mentioned the implementation since 2020. And there have been people who've been able to witness this since 2020, like you, Ryan, and some of my senior board members and some of the presidents who've been involved. I was just wondering if people would speak up and say how they feel like it's been working. I mean, I don't have any way of knowing, but there's 7 or 8 people on the call who worked with this. Does anybody want to just let me know how this is going?
Looking for volunteers. Yes, Joe, President Zakis.
Yeah, so I would just say that U of A, I think our funding, if you compared it with FTE, never quite was what, when new dollar allocated never kind of helped. So we feel it was a very positive thing for us. And so it's, and I think our budget, I think, speaks for that, is that I think we've been helped here with this process. So thank you.
Any of the presidents want to weigh in? I don't see any right now. So yes, President Rice.
I'll just agree with what President Zakis said. I think for a snapshot in time, it was an absolutely critical initiative to ensure that each of the institutions were at the level of funding of their peers. But as Ryan said, we're really moving into a new period through the combination of unified accreditation and all of that promises along with a strategic plan. I'd also add and just underscore how important the unified accreditation is because of those 3+1, 2+2 transfer agreements, which, for instance, UMPI and UMFK has done a number of them, and they really do disenfranchise the institutions in regards to how we're able to count those students. So in a unified environment, we can have those same agreements that work so effectively on the student side of things. And then if we're able to count those individuals at both of our institutions in regards to completion towards a degree, I think that will more effectively underscore the work that the institutions do together. We just weren't set up as a system to be able to codify that in a way that was fair to the institutions, which led to what Ryan Lowe described. But I think we're at a position in time that we can really rethink those metrics and the way we recognize the work that we do collaboratively across systems, and that can lead to an improved allocation model.
Thanks. President Farini Mundy.
Thank you. I have to say that I've heard this presentation a number of times, and I love the mathematics of it, and I love the glasses being adjusted and so forth. So I get kind of stuck there and don't always think about it as critically as I probably should. But there's a fairness and a real carefulness in these assumptions that are built in that I appreciate, and it seems to be overall a model that has worked well. The 2 areas that I'm interested in as our discussions go forward are the whole concept of what is a peer, given the uniqueness of our system, our arrangements, the way that research happens across our system and so forth. I think that just gets harder and harder because the data that are available through these national sources, which are used to determine these peer alignments, don't always span everything that we might care about here in the University of Maine system. And I'm not sure how we solve that going forward in a way similar to what we have. So I think what will be very important will be how we think about the concept of peers, how we add in other considerations such as board priorities and so forth, and what variables we actually look at and which ones are available in a quantified way to help us go forward.
Thanks. Clyde, we're going to get you in just a second. President McDonald.
Yes, thank you. So there is something fair about a system where your enrollment falls, your allocation falls. But for a university where the enrollment is falling, then you're in double trouble through this system. And real question is, why is enrollment falling, and what can be done to prevent it from falling? The allocation model doesn't do that, but that is really the central question, so that these universities, especially small universities, are not seeing their enrollment fall. Well, we need more analysis there and a solution to that.
Thank you, President. Clyde Mitchell.
Thank you. I think a lot of things that I was actually going to bring up have been addressed. Certainly when the model came out, I think a lot of campuses were very pleased in that it addressed what we had believed were inequities in the past. And it really did help the campuses that had been underfunded. Then coming to the 2 points the last two speakers had brought up, I wonder, I mean, I assume that the RNO's allocation would have been adjusted when it achieved its R1 status. And then I also assume, in fact, I don't assume, I know that like a campus like that I'm on, where we have been struggling with enrollments through a variety of factors, obviously it does get hit twice by having a lower allocation. And I don't necessarily see that as a problem for the allocation model, but rather as a long-term strategic priority as to what the system and what the board thinks the role of the smaller campuses are and the degree to which they need to get supported to kind of achieve their economic role in the regional areas that they serve. But Ryan, we really appreciate the work that you did on that allocation model. It was really incredible.
Thanks. Dean Softly, did you? Yes, you have your hand up. Good morning.
Thank you. You may notice as we go through the allocation model that there's not much discussion of Maine law. And Ryan and I have been working now for a couple of years to determine how Maine law can fit into this amazingly interesting mathematical calculation. And one of the things we learned right away is that Maine law has no peers, which sounds like a wonderful thing, except that it is very difficult to determine where it should fit. We get some blunt numbers from some of the other state law schools, but mostly law schools are very good at hiding the information about what they spend. They don't have the same kind of data oversight that the undergraduate institutions have. So we've been working toward that all along. But I just wanted to note that the respect and affection of my presidential colleagues is incredibly important, because as the law school came to the table, everyone's glass had a certain amount of water in it. And to get Maine law to its actual ordinary allocation, which is going to require another 1.5 or 2 million incrementally over the next year or two, means water is coming out of everybody else's glass. It is, in fact, a zero-sum game. And we're well aware that there's lots of competition for the resources. The governor, in fact, helped dramatically a year or two ago. Ryan's been working really well with all of the allocations, some of them aimed specifically at the law school. But I just wanted to make sure everybody understands why you're not hearing about the law school in the allocation complexities that Ryan just laid out. We're very much involved in the conversation, and we really appreciate what the system is doing to bring the law school to where it should be.
Thanks, Dean. Trish Riley.
I know we're pressed for time. I wonder if we ought to think a little bit, given our commitment to balanced budgets without system reserves, when the time comes that we can rebuild those system reserves, I wonder if we should add to this discussion how those systems reserves can be used to stimulate innovation, to reward collaboration and innovation instead of bailing out campuses that hopefully will be all sustained with balanced budgets.
Thanks. Pat Flood.
Thanks. I just wanted to say thank you. There's a lot of feedback that was very helpful, and Ryan, it's a great model, and just wanted to say thanks to everybody.
Thanks. Okay, we are running a little behind, but that's okay because we set aside a lot of time for a question period that I'm not sure we'll need all of it now because of the questions we've had while this has been going on. So unless there are other questions about the allocation model, let's go on to the next tab, Ryan, the campus retention rates and enrollment by campus. And then we'll probably take like a 5-minute break and then come back and complete the agenda.
Excellent. So we talk a little bit about enrollment by campus. Going to start talking about the model that we use for projecting enrollment. Talk a little bit about some of the individual campus numbers, and certainly happy to answer any questions along the way or have presidents interject with any comments that they might have as well. But we've talked, I've talked several times with this committee about the enrollment projection model and why we went to it a number of years ago. Again, just super briefly, we used to have the campuses work on this, work on these independently. So each of the individual campuses would go out and do their own enrollment assumptions. We would get them back at the system level. We would, at that time, I think we had 7 campuses. We'd stack all 7, on top of each other, and we'd call it a budget. And the problem was, as you can imagine, is that everyone was doing lots of really great things to address enrollment shortfalls. And so, nobody wants to, invest $1 million to lose 4% of your students. So campuses would make investments, and then they would, be optimistic about what those results were going to be. So maybe they would project a 1% increase in new students the next year, and every campus ends up doing the same thing. And by the time we roll it all up, we're suddenly projecting system-wide a growth of 5% in enrollments, despite the fact that the data shows us that we've lost students. And so we went to this model with the help of a former Vice Chancellor Placido and the incredibly talented team that we have at the system, that the institutional research team put this model together 3 or 4 years ago, and we've been using it ever since then. So let me just talk a little bit about the model. As you can see here again, it projects enrollment by institution, student level, tuition, residency in 4 different categories. And so I won't read all those categories. You can see that right in front of you. But what the advantage of doing it that way is, again, when we pull all of these together at the system level and we see that we've got some exciting new initiatives aimed at high school students. And when we look at how all of the individuals' numbers roll up at the system level, if our campuses are projecting that there's going to be a 3 or 4% increase in new students, and we look at high school demographics and we look at that data, we can tell whether the numbers actually support that or not. If historically we have always gotten 35% of new students, and to achieve the numbers that we have in the budget, all of a sudden that number's got to jump up to 40%, then we know that's not going to happen. And so we can go back and we can push back at the appropriate point. The continuing students, we can use, again, historical 4-year average return rates. And so really come up with some detailed projections for each of the campuses to build on. And I really want to emphasize that build on piece, because the idea is not and never was that this would be a substitute for the campus projections. Instead, it's better than a starting point, but the idea is that it is always subject to change. And I'll note that by the two bullets that we have at the bottom of this page that talks about times where we deviate from the model, and give you a couple of examples there, really related to what you're going to see in the next couple of slides. So that first one notes that, the model is based on historical trends and doesn't account for new changes in programs offered by institutions or unpredictable factors that impact enrollment. So, the easy way to think about that is that historical trends are largely going to drive this model. So if for the last 10 years, we have a campus that has lost 10% of its students every year. And we go in and we launch a number of new programs. We completely change the way we're doing financial aid. We focus on markets that we've never focused on before. The model is going to have a really difficult time kind of recognizing that bend the curve initiative, because again, it's got all of this data that is suggesting we should be looking at a downward trend in credit hours. So when we go in and we launch a bunch of new things, the model really struggles with saying, oh, great, and now let's start bend that curve. It's going to want to keep pushing enrollment down. And to the point of the second bullet, it works exactly the same with growth. And so, if you look at a program that is growing rapidly, like academic partnerships at Presque Isle, significant increases in the last few years, at some point, maybe never, but at some point, we're going to expect that growth, it's not going to continue at 40% a year. And so at some point, it's going to level off at some level, some sustainable level. Whenever that happens, that we think it's going to start leveling off, we're going to have the same issue with the model. The model is going to see several years of 30, 40, 50% growth, and it's going to want to keep pushing that growth up. So those are the examples where the model might say, we're looking at 10,000 new credit hours, but we know just from looking at the data that we've started to max out, and that maybe it's only going to be 8, or maybe it's only going to be 7. So those kind of things were always assumed from the very beginning. And I wanted to note those because we do have some examples of that. You're going to see, the Farmington and the Fort Kent projections. Seeing some positive signs at Fort Kent that make us want to reevaluate where the model is suggesting we're going. But the model wants to keep pushing enrollment down at Fort Kent, despite what we're seeing this year. Same thing at Farmington, and then I mentioned the Presque Isle example as well. So before I get into the actual projections, I did want to pause just for a second. Wanted to see if there was anything that Jeff wanted to add about the model or any of that, and then I'll dive right into to the changes. Right. I'm going to assume Jeff's good. So let me move on to enrollment. So the way that we have set up the PowerPoint or your materials. Again, we took each of the individual campuses. This is all information that you were provided in March, and we just pulled it all together into a single document or a single presentation. So right up front, you'll see the IR projection in the left column, what the campus projected, the change and the change percentage. It is broken out by in-state, out-of-state, by graduate and undergraduate. And then anytime there's a change, we've asked the campus to help us understand why you are deviating from the model. So in the case of the University of Maine, we work very closely with the president's team and Deb Allen and the IR team at UMaine. Our projections tend to be really, really close. And you can see that is the case this time. The campus has made some appropriate adjustments up and down, but at the end of the day, we're well under a 1% difference between the IR projections from the system and those from the campus. At Machias, again, very similar, just slightly over a 1% change. UMA, again, largely right on target. But again, like you look up here under undergraduate, you can see a difference of about 817 credit hours. Here's specifically why we're making that adjustment. Some addition of some athletic teams, stronger spring enrollment. Those are the things that the model hasn't taken into account. And so the campus is making an adjustment for that. These are positive adjustments. We also make negative adjustments as well. So again, you can see we're well within that kind of 1% deviation. At Farmington, it's a little bit larger. Again, like Fort Kent, that you'll see on the next page, anytime you start to deviate from what has consistently been some double-digit losses in students, the model really struggles to kind of pick that up. So you will see some deviations here. About 3,500 credit hours different from the model, about a 10% gap. Again, you can see those explanations over here on the right. A lot of times when we see a deviation of more than 1%, historically, it's because we're adding new programs. The model is going to look at the programs that you're offering, but if you add a brand new program that is super exciting, you expect to see some growth there. Those are the places where it's appropriate that we make deviations. So again, same thing here at Fort Kent, seeing that incoming class. This is something that the president and the president's team talked about in March, starting to see some really positive enrollment indicators for that new incoming class, well above previous trends. And so that's the reason for the nearly 9% deviation that you see here. At Presque Isle, again, you can see the deviation right there in the middle of the page. It's exactly the example that we were talking about earlier. A nearly 8,000 credit hour increase, about a 42% growth in the Your Pace program. Growth so substantial, even outpacing what the model is projecting there. I think the last slides I have in this space are at USM and the law school. Both of those, again, pretty consistent with what we're seeing from our IR team. Exactly the same at USM with no changes, and some modest changes down at the law school, just reflecting some 23 enrollment numbers that are a little bit higher. A new online program there as well. So I think that gets me through that piece. And let me pause there, see if there are any questions, and also going to plug my computer in before that dies.
Okay, questions for Ryan on this last agenda item we just had? Yeah, I'm not seeing any. So we're due to go into executive session at 11. I'm guessing that many of the questions people may have already been asked. So why don't we take just a very short break here until 10:35, and let's come back in and resume at 10:35 and go to 11 with questions. If we run over a couple of minutes, that'll be fine as well. So see you all back at 10:35.
Hey, Ryan, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to ask a question. When we were back around the end of March, we were talking about a 3% change downward in enrollment, 24 versus 23. Does that still hold water, or has that changed?
Let me get you an update on that. I think that's generally in the same ballpark, maybe adjusted just a little bit, but I'm reluctant to say it out loud, even though that's what I'm doing right now, until I just
Okay.
check.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, welcome back. So we have between now and 11 set aside for any questions people have, any discussion the committee wishes to have on anything you've heard this morning. Let me just start by saying, I think we always get excellent written materials, but this month, this particular meeting is even above and beyond what we usually get. Most of these, I think, were created specifically for this meeting, and they're very succinct summaries of their subject matter. So, Ryan, thank you to you and your team for creating these.
Thanks.
Before we start with questions, Ryan, I think you had one other matter you wanted to raise.
Yep. I just want to let everyone know that included in your materials are a handful of items that during the budget meetings or after the budget meetings, folks have asked for additional information on. But they were not presenting on this morning. They were just really fact-based requests. And so one of them was campus retention rates. So I wanted to make sure you knew that that was included in your materials by campus, by categories. Also in there was documents on campus efficiencies. So, again, if we're going to go to the legislature for asking for additional resources, if we're going to ask students for additional tuition dollars, I think it's incumbent on us to be as efficient as we can with the resources we have. And I feel like the campuses have done that. We went through a process of highlighting those at the March meeting. So most of these are familiar, but what we did was kind of essentially pull them all from various slide presentations and in different places and kind of pulled them all into one area, made the formats a little bit more consistent. And so that information is included in your materials as well. Two other items that we included, there was a request for campus reserve amounts. And so you'll see those included in your materials, kind of where we were starting out 23. What are we doing in 2023 for stabilization funds? What does 24 look like? And then where do we end up? And you can see that information in here at the system and campus levels. We've also had lots of movement on electricity and natural gas pricing. And so Gretchen and her team put together a short 3-page summary in here of what we're seeing in that space as well. Always want to end with something positive. So wanted to include these great pictures of my canine friends at home. Now we're happy to take any questions that you might have.
4 dogs?
3 right now.
Oh.
Yeah.
Any questions on these dogs or any other subject? All right, why don't we open up for questions on anything we've discussed this morning or any of those materials that Ryan's just told us about. I hope we all take a real close look, in particular at those beside the dogs, at the efficiencies, because we are asking for an increase. We are seeking a tuition increase as well, and it's hard to do that without being able to say that we're trying to do everything we can to tighten our belt and cut and consolidate where we can. So those are good summaries. Questions? Yes, Chair Riley.
I would just add that the efficiency slide was great. We've been asking that for a long time, and I know it's a first. So it would be great if we could synthesize that and just put the numbers in a single chart to show how those efficiencies are beginning to show real dollars.
Thanks. Questions, discussion. So Ryan, just so we're clear, we talked about this before, but the legislature passed its continuing services budget. It's obviously got to consider a supplemental budget. Our request for an additional 4.5 million each year of the biennium was not part of the continuing services budget, is part of the, hopefully, of the supplemental budget, but we won't know that for some time, but we're still making that assumption. Is that fair?
Just one correction. We asked for a 4.5% increase each year.
Percent, yes.
Not million.
Right.
Yeah. But yes, that's exactly right. We expect that it's likely that the administration would be presenting a change package after the Revenue Forecasting Committee comes out with their report, which is expected sometime this month, and then we would expect the committee to go into discussions from there and have every reason to be optimistic about that. We've got strong bipartisan votes in the Education Committee, but certainly we'll have to go through the process like everyone else.
Thanks. Other questions? Discussion on any subject we've talked about today?
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I had a question. Ryan, on that same regard, I'm kind of worried that someday we might be asked to come talk to some people about the budget request. And I'm still a little fuzzy on Roger's question, just kind of clarified that for me. But is there a one pager, a very simple one pager that would just show the 23 actual that we spent, or we're going to spend, the 24 request by a couple of categories, that might make sense, and then the 24 approved in part 1, and then the 24 pending, I guess. That would help me just to have my thoughts, all my ducks in a row, if you will. And I know there was some other auxiliary pieces put in there too. It seemed like there were some other suggested additions or whatever that might still be in play. If that could just go on a one pager, it would help me think through it a little better. Is that all right?
Yeah, we have a really great one pager that Sam Warren put together for a lot of our legislative conversations. I take it with me when I go to the State House, just as a reminder of what we asked and what the dollar amounts were. And so we'll update that for the part 1, part 2 kind of conversations and get that out to everyone.
Yeah. As a former legislator, I think in those only in simple terms, like so many folks do at that time of year. So that would be very helpful. Thanks.
Absolutely.
I don't need anything special. It sounds like I just need, send me a copy of what you guys have.
You got it. We'll send that to everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks. Barbara Alexander?
Yeah, thank you. My question is whether the stakeholders in the committee when they were considering their support for our additional funding, do they know about the 3% tuition increase that's built into our budget?
They do. We had a good conversation with the education committee on a couple of occasions. We've been there. They've asked us some questions about the increase, the impact of the increase, some historical information about it. So we have had conversations with them. Yes.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments?
On that same note,
Yes.
Ryan, what about the appropriation committee? Because ultimately we'll end up there on the tuition increase. So that and are there any problems in that committee?
Not that we know of yet. We're, as you would know, we're gonna work that and have lots of conversations. We've had good conversations to date. We had lots of good conversations. For instance, you'll recall that the one-time tuition relief money that we got last year, we had to have lots of conversations to make sure that got rolled into this kind of part one budget that they're working on now. So ended up having lots of conversations with our Democratic and Republican friends on the committee. So they were very aware of kind of how that piece fit into our overall plan and the tuition piece of that. But we're not going to rely on a conversation we had a couple of months ago where, Sam is continuing to have those conversations. We've met on multiple occasions with the commissioner. The chancellor's had multiple conversations with the governor. We're going to keep up the same full court press all the way through the end.
Thank you.
Okay, for the benefit of the committee, once we deal with this year's budget and start the next fiscal year, if there are subjects that committee members would like to see brought up at our FFT meetings, like to dig a little bit deeper into any particular areas, please let me know and we'll try to get those scheduled as part of our ongoing meetings in fiscal 24.
If I could, Mr. Chair,
Yes.
Along that same point, if there are parts of the presentation that you found particularly helpful, if there are parts that you thought, boy, it would have been great if I could see this, please let me know. We've been doing these, these presentations in kind of this format since we unified finances probably 7 or 8 years ago. And the presentations this year's presentation is better than last year's and so on because of the good feedback we get. And so we find slides that the trustees like. And so we put those in next year and we standardize them. We're not looking to ever get to the point where we give you 7 campus presentations that all look the same. But if we're going to be talking about retention, if we're going to be talking about reserves or efficiencies, it makes sense to have them in a consistent format that you can follow from campus to campus. And so if you have any of those observations, please let me know, the chair know, and we'll take those notes and we'll be ready for next year.
Thanks, Ryan. Other questions, comments? I'm not seeing any. So Ellen, there's no reason we cannot go into executive session sooner than we said, is there?
That's correct. You can.
All right. Okay, so we plan to go into executive session. We don't plan to conduct any business after we come out of executive session. I understand that the presidents will be joining us for the first part of the executive session, perhaps not for the entire thing. So if there's nothing further, could I solicit a motion for the Finance, Facilities, and Technology Committee of the Board of Trustees to go into executive session under the provisions of 1 MRSA Section 405-6A to discuss the evaluation of personnel and the consideration and discussion of appointments, evaluations, employment, and duties, as well as 1 MRSA Section 405-6C to discuss the condition, acquisition, or disposition of real property or economic development if premature disclosure of the information would prejudice the competitive or bargaining position of the University Maine system.
So moved.
Moved by Trustee Mishu,
Second.
seconded by Trustee Kane. Any discussion? Seeing none, Ellen, could you call the roll?
Trustee Cates,
Yes.
Trustee Kane,
Yes.
trustee Flood,
Yes.
trustee McMahon,
Yes.
trustee Mishu,
Yes.
trustee Riley.
Yes.
The motion is carried.
So you will transfer us?
In just a moment.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, those of you who are leaving.